Hi, and welcome everyone to the Places Medicine podcast. My name's Carrie Denning Jackson, and I'm delighted to be here. So, we have talked a lot about, the relationship between our health and the world we live in. So, we've talked about what's inside of our homes, air, water, materials in our walls, even mold. We've talked about nature, so what trees can do to our nervous systems, what it means to have green space nearby or not nearby. Today, I really want to zoom out and talk about the street and the sidewalk outside of your door or the lack of one. Whether you can walk to a grocery store or you need to jump in a car, whether your kid can walk to school, ride a bike without it being genuinely dangerous. So, most of us haven't really thought too much about the streets and the neighborhoods we live in and whether or not they've been designed. And in fact, someone actually has done that. Someone's thought about putting in a sidewalk or how fast you can go drive down a street. And these decisions, which we'll learn about in this podcast, are made by engineers following standards that when I learned about them, I was blown away. I hadn't even heard of, some of these standards and why we have speed limits set the way they are, for example. And these all have profound impacts on our health. Is it dangerous for me to walk down the sidewalk? And is there danger of a car accident? But also more broadly thinking about how the neighborhoods we live in have been designed. So my guest today, Beth Osborne, has spent her career thinking about this. She's worked at the highest levels of federal government on transportation policy, and she now leads Smart Growth America, which is an organization dedicated to helping communities build streets and neighborhoods that really do work for them. So, Beth, I'm delighted to have you on. Thank you so much.
I'm delighted to be here. And I have to say, I love what you're doing with this podcast. It does such a good job of connecting things that we experience every day, like what we're going to talk about today, the street outside our door, to our health in ways we just don't think about. We're like the fish in water that we don't see the water, but all around us are these things that have profound impacts on us. And bringing that to light is really important. So I'm super excited to talk about the way we design transportation in communities and how it not just shapes how we get around, but how healthy we can be.
And I'm very excited because many might not know, but my very first job out of grad school was working on transportation policy. So I'm a bit of a transportation nerd. So I'm very excited about this.
Fantastic.
So I want to just start at the top with this idea that, many people maybe haven't thought about that, our streets feel like they just exist. Maybe they've always been there, but really somebody actually designed them and thought them through and made choices around them. So can you walk us a little bit through, how are our streets made and designed and why that matters?
Yeah, normal non-transportation nerds do not spend their time thinking about the way their road is designed or estimating how wide the lanes are. Most people just get used to it being around them and don't think too hard about it, nor should they have to. So how wide our lanes are, that is a deliberate choice. There's a gigantic book that engineers have on their desk that talk about when lanes should be 12 feet versus 10 feet versus 14 feet, whether or not there's a sidewalk and how wide it has to be, whether there is a crosswalk and what color the paint should be. These are all policy decisions, often passed off as science-based engineering decisions, and they are made by people following standards, but those standards are not science-based. Most of it is an accumulation of practice that people have gotten used to and gotten good at, and the public is not aware of them. They've never seen them, and they've certainly never voted on.
And so tell me a little bit, when we were talking a few weeks ago, what struck me is really interesting was that streets are designed to move cars quickly. So what does that mean for the rest of us? And tell people a little bit about that, about how the actual how the street is designed to really do that, to be a throughput for cars.
Absolutely. What I want you to have in your mind is your typical 5-lane main road. They're particularly ubiquitous in the suburbs, but most cities have them too. It's 2 lanes in each direction. There's a middle turn lane that is affectionately nicknamed the suicide lane to give you a sense of the level of safety in our design.
That's how engineers nickname it, the suicide lane.
It is a term that is used by many. Now,
Oof.
engineers, when you say it, especially a critic like me, they will recoil. They will say it's a turn lane or,
Mhm.
something like that. But I didn't make it up. So it just tells you the extent to which, while people aren't thinking a lot about it or aren't intending to make something unsafe, we're somewhat aware of it anyway. And so these are generally roads. The lanes are relatively wide. The roads themselves are wide. They're very straight. The blocks are very long, so you don't have to stop very often. Most of them don't have sidewalks. If they do, they're very narrow. And if you're walking along them, you're crossing driveways constantly. You're having very few opportunities to cross the street. The corners, the turn radius is really wide so that you don't have to slow down as you take that right hand turn. In fact, there's something called a slip lane. That's the lanes where you can take a right without coming to the light and stopping before turning right. And they're designed so that you don't have to slow down as you turn right. But what's right in the middle of that slip lane but a crosswalk? So you, as the driver, are being told by the design, no need to slow down as you turn, but if you see someone in the crosswalk, you should also stop on a dime. And there is something called physics that makes that impossible. But that design is considered appropriate and standard. So there's all these things in the standards that come from the desire to keep those cars moving. You don't want someone to have to wait at the light to have to turn right. That would be crazy. So we'll create a slip lane. And then, oh, shoot, someone might have to cross here. What do we do with them? Just throw them into the lane. So it's actually pretty simple to get this right. And all the rest of the developed world has done it. All of our peer nations have done it. And a lot of developing nations have done it. If you look at where we rank in safety, it's below a huge number of very poor third world nations. And it's because our goal is to keep the cars moving, not to get people places or to get them there safely. So to do safe, you can either have high speeds, but then you make everything very simple. Think of your interstate, controlled entrances and exits, no cross streets, no driveways, no vulnerable users like bicyclists and pedestrians, no development along there, very separated from oncoming traffic, simple, straight, controlled. You can go fast and be safe in that environment. If you're serving businesses and homes in any environment, big city, little city, rural village, and you have lots of cross streets, you have crosswalks, you have on-street parking, you have driveways, every single one of those is a point of conflict. And that point of conflict uh, is super risky when speeds are high, because as you go faster, your view shed shrinks. So you can't anticipate a problem as quickly. And then when you see it, you're going at high speed. So stopping in time becomes hard because, again, physics. So if there is a crash, it's harder to avoid. And if there is one, it's more likely to be deadly. So if you want to have all that complexity, speeds have to come way down. And what the US tries to do is have speed and complexity. And we knew in the 1950s that wouldn't work. That's why when we created the interstate system, we said we can't move people quickly through these in-town roads. Let's create a separated system, because that's the only sane way to do it. That's the only safe way to do it. But over the last 70 years, the federal program that funds roads has expanded to include more roads that are at surface level or are local roads, and we've taken those standards and we've applied them in a one-size-fits-all way so that you've got speed in all environments, no matter how dangerous.
And tell a little, I mean, this is mind blowing, but tell a little bit about how speed limits are set. I
Yeah.
found that really fascinating. And then I do want to kind of unpack a little bit about what you just said around how these are federal policies that are not just on interstates anymore, but are actually affecting many of our local roads. So really making that clear to people what that means. But maybe speed limits first.
Yeah, and I'm going to back up to something called level of service before I get to speed limit. So when we design a roadway, we evaluate something called level of service, and that is how many cars do you expect to be on the roadway and how fast do you want them to go? And we always want them to go fast. So we design the roadway with a particular speed in mind. But on interstates, one thing you know is at high speed, people often go faster than the speed limit. Or if they're going even the speed limit and fast, there's times where you might lose control of the vehicle a little bit and you're getting ready to go into the other lane and you realize you don't have space and you come back quickly. And so you want a lot of extra space to help make up for any small mistake or for something like that, which is likely. We're all human. And even, even when you're doing everything safely, something may become clear at the last minute and you just have to correct. So you want to have a lot of wiggle room. Well, once the concept of level of service and how many cars and how fast they're going to be going is designed for, then they build a little buffer so that people can make mistakes and regain control. And that brings in a lot of strange byproducts. One is people drive faster than the speed limit planned for, because the wider you make the road and the straighter you make the road, the more it feels like a highway and the more people follow the design. For those that listen to the podcast 99% Invisible, it's one of those things that that indicates something in your subconscious, and everybody follows, even the safest drivers. And so you find roads where the speed limit's 25, but the design speed is 40. And people will drive 40 because the speed limit comes up every half mile or so, but the design is everywhere. So then agencies will come in and do something called a speed study, and they'll look at how fast people are actually going on the road. And you would think if they find too many people are going above the speed limit, they'd say, all right, we got to get in here with the design and figure out how to make it uncomfortable to violate the speed limit, make it easy to do the right thing. That is not what they do. They say, oh, everybody's going 40 miles per hour, the design speed, that's now the new speed limit. And then when they come back to redesign the roadway, they design it for 40 miles per hour with a buffer. And then they do a speed study and it goes up and up and up. And that's the opposite of what all our peer countries do. They say, oh, people are violating the speed limit. We've done the design wrong. We're going to make it easy for people to do the right thing and uncomfortable for people to do the wrong thing with that design.
And so, how does that work then when clearly there's a street where people are going too fast and there's a school there, or there's, needed to have more crosswalks? And this gets to the question of, you know, who's actually in charge of the street? Is it the local municipality? Is it the mayor? Like, who's the one pushing back to say, hey, actually, the street's way too fast. There's a lot of kids biking on it. Like, talk a little bit about that.
It's a great question. And I was just having a conversation about this yesterday with an engineer in an engineering firm. And we were talking about how there's so many players in the system that you think it would kind of shake things up because it would bring new ideas in. But what we find in transportation is that if anybody stands up for the status quo, all ideas bounce back to the status quo, and that wins. Doesn't matter how many of the other players are saying, let's try something different. And I think that's greatly because our transportation program is rarely focused on outcomes, nor is any of the discourse around it around outcomes. It's all about the way we've always done things. So one thing that people don't know, I mean, I'm a transportation nerd who works in the field, and I can't tell you who owns all the roads in the area. I'm in Washington, D.C. now, but I grew up in New Orleans. I don't know which ones are state roads and which one are parish roads, but it's a city parish thing there. But in other places, it might be your county or parish, it might be your locality, it might be the state. And you need a safe system for safety, but your local mayor only controls the local roads. And so that can become very challenging. Even if you get all of your roads right, they then cross roads other people own, and they may not have the same priorities you have. So because of that, it tends to be that cities are trying to make them slower and safer, and the states are not. And that is because the states' highway programs built up around the interstate program, and they're thinking about moving people across great distances. And when that approach comes into the city, two things happen. One is they have a mismatch of skills versus need, but also they bring a belief that is often unspoken, but it's there, that internal travel is not their priority. It is that long distance travel. So if you get into a debate about this neighborhood is being harmed by this design, they will immediately go to, their priority, which is the people trying to get through your community. That's who they're there to help, not the locals. And the locals are, if they're trying to get a crossing, they're in the way. They're slowing down the priority, which is moving people over vast distances. So it's always a real struggle for mayors that want to make a change, and the mayors that have the most success are the ones that tend not to have a whole lot of state roads in their town.
And I think what I want listeners and viewers to really, the tagline in their head that they should remember is the idea of dangerous by design, which is, I know, a report that you all put out, but it's really the thinking of like, we are designing in many ways these streets that are dangerous by design. What I want to get from you is also like, how did we get here? Like, it's somewhat with our interstate system, but why are we doing this in a way and our peer countries aren't? You talked a little bit about the psychology, but maybe a bit about the history of like, how did we get in this situation?
It's a great question, and there have been some people who have written about it, but I think unfortunately it's normally nerds like me that want to want to read about it. So it feels like things have always been this way, and they haven't. It's really a relatively new approach to transportation, and it's an approach that continues to not work, and yet we're in it. So, back when in the early days, so, a little over 100 years ago, roads were not paved. They were where business took place. They were busy, chaotic environments that you would transact sales and have markets in the roadway, and you would have, horses and buggies and stuff like that come through, but they had to get through all that chaos. Interestingly, when bicycles were invented, it was folks that loved bicycling that called for the paving of the roads for their
Well,
bicycles.
makes
And
sense.
of course,
Yeah.
especially the old bicycles, which were, not as able to leap over bumps and stuff like our bikes today. But then cars came along and they could go fast, and drivers drove them fast in chaotic environments, and started killing a lot of people. And so the auto industry came along and called for safety by clearing all those pesky people and all the other purposes out of the roadway for their cars. They made up a term called jaywalking. Jay was a term at the time that was an insulting term for a rural person. And the notion was you came to the big city, don't act like a rural rube and go stepping off into the roadway any place. It needs to be controlled, and you should only cross in designated places and in as few places as possible so those cars could keep
And
moving.
now I feel like the term jaywalk is like a compliment for a New Yorker. It's like
Well,
a
yeah,
badge of pride that you're a jaywalker. That's funny.
it is
Interesting.
a wild thing. So
Yeah.
back in the 30s, the states started building highways to connect their towns. And then President Eisenhower, after coming back from World War II, was so impressed by the German highway system that he wanted to build a similar highway system to connect our country, sea to shining sea, for the purpose of being able to deploy troops and defense equipment in case we were ever invaded by water. So we started building the interstates in the 50s, and that coincided with a time when a lot of housing was being built in that first ring of suburbs. And people with money, and particularly white folks, were moving to that first ring of suburbs and bringing businesses with them. And the center city was starting to struggle. So there was a belief at the time that if we built our highways straight to that downtown or through that downtown, and people could come from the suburbs quickly, get off the highway, and be right by the retail that they might come back to it. That did not work, and it took up a ton of valuable downtown land. As they were taking up some of that downtown land, political leaders found it useful to utilize the placement of the highways for urban revitalization, which meant clearing Black neighborhoods or minority neighborhoods. And we have another report on that called Divided by Design that talks not just about where they were placed and why, but also the standards that live on today from those times that keep creating the problem. We act like it's in the past, but it's not. It is very present. That decision making, even if the intention isn't there, remains in our program today. And one example is this notion of solving for congestion. So we don't define congestion the way normal people would think we do. Congestion is where speeds are slower during rush hour than they would be in the middle of the night. Now,
Okay.
normal people don't believe we should have free-flowing conditions in rush hour. They just don't want the awful congestion. But the way we define congestion is based on that ratio. And there's also a bunch of things I know we'll talk about in land use where we spread out the development. And one reason we value speed is on some level, we know we made the things you need to get to hard to get to because they're far away. So we'll make it up to you by allowing you to travel fast. And so then if there's congestion, we understand that that's an added difficulty because we already made these destinations hard to get to because they're far away. And back in the 50s, when they first started looking at how to determine if the roadway was functioning, they actually wanted to measure how many places you could get to, and by all modes of travel. But that would have been really hard then because you'd have to look at every origin and every destination. That would take a lot of people. It would take a lot of data. It would take a lot of money and time. And by the time you put it together, it could be overtaken by events because it could take years to do.
Mm-hmm.
And so they said, well, we're not going to look at speed and distance. We're just going to look at speed. Now, that might make sense when you're adding a new way of getting around over the old ways. But when you're putting things through the middle of the city, disrupting the grid, and actually taking away old ways of getting around, just looking at speed creates a problem. So think about a roadway where it says no left-hand turn all the way down the road. That's because if someone took a left-hand turn, it would slow people who are going from one side of the highway to the other side of the highway or the study area. And we can't have that because the point is to make sure there's never any slowdown or any congestion. But if you need to go left to your destination, now your only option is to go right at least 3 times, if not go wildly out of your way. And in spite of the fact that it takes you longer to get where you're going, in our system, that is a time savings because on that roadway, no one ever had to slow down. So we're getting further and further away from the outcome of you getting where you need to go. And you're having to slow down to park or arrive in an area where a bunch of people coming to is something that is so bad in transportation, we would knock down the buildings and get rid of the destinations to get that traffic moving again. Because we have this measure that was the best we could do in the late 1940s by the smartest minds we had at that time who assumed we would iterate on it, but we never did. And so we're holding people to standards that are foolish, and we're not making them check back on their work to see if they're getting the outcomes that they think. So in spite of the fact that they keep building like this and congestion keeps getting worse and worse, they never have to look back and check that. So they keep making the same bad assumptions, making the same promises, but it takes so long for the results to be seen. People don't make that connection either in elected office or in the public. And we just keep getting worse and worse outcomes.
I want to do a quick ask. I think the obvious one that people might have is, okay, well, tell me about, what would autonomous vehicles
Mm-hmm.
change this in some way? And my thought is actually like maybe, but also it's the roads are designed in a certain way and the vehicle is going to follow the design. I mean, it will drive the speed limit, but
Yes.
if it's being routed without making the left turns, it can't avoid that. But talk briefly about how you see autonomous vehicles maybe improving this.
Yeah, there are a lot of ways AVs could come into the system. One of my biggest concerns is, in the early days of vehicles, we saw danger or disruption to the driver, and so we cleared the road of people. I can see, AVs being disrupted by people getting in their way. And I could see a revisiting of that. That's a problem. The AVs will work better if we just get those stupid pedestrians out of their way. So I want to be careful of what we are naming as the objective for autonomous vehicles and creating a policy environment that connects the outcomes we want to the design of the roadways and the policies we put in place. Right now, everyone has a different reason for AVs, and many of the reasons are conflicting. So some people want everyone to be able to get into a car and go wherever they want. Other people want to have fewer cars on the road so that we have less congestion. But if the goal of AVs is for everyone to be in a car anytime they want, you're not going to have congestion free roads. And in fact, I can look, I am always a person who can come up with the worst case scenario. But the reason for that is if you can prevent it. And what I'm seeing in the policy conversation is a refusal to believe that there's any downside, which is how I know we will have the worst outcomes. Other nations will put together policies that avoid them because they will admit that things could go wrong and they'll create a system where they won't. But I can absolutely see a system where, someone doesn't want to pay for parking, for example. And so they don't have to pay for parking if they program their AV to circle the block while they run a quick errand. And now you've got 5% of people doing that at any time. And now the whole roadway system breaks down with empty vehicles just trying to find a place to be while a bunch of people are running their errands. And so if we want AVs to work, we can do that, but we need to put in place things right now. For example, let's tax people through the nose if they're running empty vehicles. So there is an economic incentive to keep vehicles full. Let's make sure that having AVs moving is not as important as having, or is equally important to having people be able to get to those AVs. Every trip starts with a walking trip. So we want to make sure that pedestrians can move around with those AVs just fine. The other thing is, if you watch the videos on YouTube of people testing AVs, one thing you find is the computer's just as befuddled by bad roadway design as we are. And so I hear a lot of people saying, well, they're safer. Right now they're not automated. There are people overseas that are actually running them, as we've learned recently with Waymo. But the other thing is, you see them not know where to stop because the crosswalk is not well painted, or it's not clear if the right lane is a parking lane or if it's a right-hand turn lane. And the computer gets just as confused as people do. And right now in this country, every time the design fails, we blame the people, and somehow the agencies with the dangerous design are protected. And so I think we will get low level outcomes out of the computers unless we design in a way that would make humans operate better too, at which point we could have done that all along, just like all organizations.
Yeah.
So,
but it may surface some issues, and maybe in a strange way, Waymo's more believed than people complaining about it in some way.
It could be. Yeah. I will say, as a parent of a teenage girl, there are other concerns I have with vehicles that are empty. Obviously, there have been problems with drivers, but tell me who's there to protect my daughter if she gets into a Waymo and someone pushes their way in. Tell me, what happens if people are, making drug deals inside of a car. Think about the worst case scenario, plan for it, and then I have confidence. But this notion that tech will save us terrifies me because it never has.
I think that that does not always save, often causes challenges. So I want to just kind of summing all this up, and then we can dig more into other ways of thinking about health, but you guys publish a report every year, Dangerous by Design. I alluded to it. And the numbers are really shocking. About 7,500 pedestrians die in the US. That's about one person every 20 minutes, which is a sobering number. So just share a little bit about the everything we've just discussed, going too fast, dangerous by design, roadways designed for speed, the implications of that then for people.
Yes, the people who bear the burden are people who are more likely to be non-drivers. So that's kids walking to school, that's aging populations who may not be able to move across roads as quickly and they're more frail. It's also Black Americans are killed while pedestrians in a car wreck more than 2 times the rate of white people. Native Americans, it's now approaching 6 times.
Why is that? Is that because the neighborhoods they're in don't have sidewalks, don't have safe crossing areas? What is the background on that?
Yeah, there are a couple things. I mean, one, safety is very much related to income. So higher income neighborhoods do have safer roads or fewer pedestrian deaths, let's say that. And lower income neighborhoods have much more. And there are a couple things. One is the higher income you are, the more likely you are to have access to a car and therefore not have to face the danger if it exists. But also the higher income you are, the more likely you are to be able to advocate for change in that neighborhood, the more access you're going to have to power. And further, there are many neighborhoods in the country that were built before the car that maintain narrow, slow moving streets. And they are rare, but the people who can gobble up the housing because there's so much demand for it and so little supply are people with money. They can bid their way into it by being willing to run up the cost of the housing. And if you want to live in a neighborhood like that, and maybe a mayor wanted to build more communities like that, it's against the law. Our our land use rules prohibit the market from meeting the demand. So you have all of these things working in favor of those with money and excluding those without money. So when you have less money, you're more likely to have to walk. You're more likely to have to walk more, and you're more likely to be in a less desirable neighborhood. And I mean, I remember when my parents were looking for the house I grew up in New Orleans, rule number 1 was they were never going to buy a house on a busy high-speed street. But those houses were way cheaper. So we already knew we had to look for way longer to find the house on a safe street that we could afford because they would never consider that. And a lot of people don't get to make that decision. And then they're less powerful to call for a change. And what's interesting is it's just not good for drivers either. I mean, everything we're doing that is pro driver it is generating more congestion, longer trips, more expense. And we call that, car centric, driver centric. It's actually quite driver hostile. And because our goal is those high speed vehicles, when we say safety is a priority in this country, what we mean is as safe as you can get so long as the cars are moving fast. And so there is just a story out of Colorado about a man whose wife was hit by a car at a intersection with a high speed roadway, and he had been advocating for a light to be put in there. And people who drove through that didn't want a light there because they didn't want to have to slow down. And this week, he was killed in the exact same place. And the best we are hearing from the state DOT is they will expedite the study about whether or not it's appropriate to put a stop sign or a light there.
Oof,
And I
when
can
really
tell you, based on the things they're held to account to, the standards and the rules, it will tell them no, because the point is to keep the cars moving. And we as a country have decided that, 40,000 people dying a year is just okay.
yeah, that's very sobering to hear all of this, and hopefully eye-opening for people listening and watching, because again, these are things that, when we think about our health, street design may not be something that comes up, but in fact, it's very important
Yes.
when you think about our safety, our kids' safety, families. So, going beyond safety, kind of jumping into a part two here, I'd love for you to share a bit about the health impacts of living in a place where it is hard to walk around, where you
Okay.
are, you need to get in a car to go to your job or drop your kid off at school, go to the grocery store. Um, so, share a little bit about that and kind of the notion of land use and how we think about it.
Absolutely. There are more impacts than just facing being in a wreck and being killed or seriously injured. We're always being told to get outside. We do want to get outside. We want to walk to that park. I've loved your podcast about the importance of being in nature. And even in cities, we're not far from some fabulous parks. I'm a short distance from Rock Creek Park, which is a beautiful park through central DC, and is a real escape from the loud city. But if you have to take your life into your hand to get there, you're less likely to go to those places. And driving to those places can be a challenge as well. I remember there's a congressman who just retired from Portland, Oregon, who would often say, let's pray for the person caught in congestion on the way to the gym to ride a stationary bike. This is kind of the twisted way we've gotten to getting to doing something active that will give us longevity and a higher quality of life and stronger cardiovascular system. That transportation system that is just seeking to keep those cars moving at high speed is blocking our way to just move around as part of our daily life. And they're nowhere in the departments of transportation's measurements about how to design that road or what is success. And so we're often blamed for not moving around as part of our daily life, but it's hard to move around on our own 2 feet when every place we need to go is far away, and the roads that are designed to get us there are designed to only get people inside a car there fast. There's no way to cross the road. There's no place for you to be. Even when there's a place for you to be, you know that people can't quite see you. If you go to a place with better lighting, but that's not the place with a crosswalk, it's your fault for crossing where the lighting is good and the crosswalk isn't. If you go to the crosswalk and the drivers can't see you there, it's your fault for being in the road where the lighting was bad. And so, that anxiety means people may choose not to walk to the grocery, even if it is close by. There's a congressman from Texas that talked about in Texas, he lived just a couple blocks away from the grocery and he had never driven to it anywhere at any time in his life. But in DC, when he came up here, he was 6 blocks from the grocery and he had never driven to it. And that making it easy to just move around as part of your daily life, so being active doesn't require something special and extra and another demand on your time, is a really important way to make us healthy. It's also important because it cuts down on air pollution. And it is amazing to find out that some of the pollution hotspots in your community are schools, because it's impossible for your kid to walk there. So everyone, and we don't have money to pay for enough school buses. So people are driving their kids there and dropping them and standing in traffic
Hmm.
to drop their kid off and emitting into the air. And that becomes one of the most dangerous places to breathe. So
Yeah.
there are just these, and then, I mean, there's also runoff from the roads that get into our water supply. It goes on and on. And particularly in poor neighborhoods, that pavement, especially when there's a lot of it, creates heat island effect. And so heat is more, and there's this belief that trees are dangerous because if you're going at high speed and lose control of your vehicle and you hit the tree, it's more likely to be deadly. But no one ever says, well, maybe if we just slow down traffic so that if you do, it's not deadly. It just, we just kind of backed ourselves into these weird circumstances. And then we blame people for behaving in a rational way where they don't want to be out on that.
Hmm.
They don't, and the drivers too, where they're just following the design. But if the design tells you to do the wrong thing, that's your fault. And we all kind of know that's the case because we've all heard of the term speed trap.
I just want to pull on something you said about trees. Are there occasions where, the powers that be that design the roads do remove trees
Yes,
because of a safety
yes.
issue for cars? Wow.
Yes, they like to have something called a clear zone on the side of the road, which is why they like the buildings to be set back. But then think about what's in the clear zone, the
People.
sidewalk and the pedestrians. And that meets the safety standard. It's so it's
It's
twisted. I'm
fascinating.
actually going to Boise, Idaho, and I just heard this is a big issue out there where Idaho, uh, their highway agency doesn't like trees. They think trees are unsafe because if someone loses control of their vehicle and hits the tree, they could die. And they won't consider slowing down traffic so that that's less likely to happen. Or if they hit the tree, it's not dead.
That's really interesting because one of the studies I talk about a lot is the Greenheart study in Louisville, Kentucky, where
Absolutely.
they planted trees to see over, 4 square mile area over multiple years to see the impact of greenery on people's health. And they were intentional about putting lots of evergreens along the highway corridor because it did improve air quality. Notably, in one area, it was right by a school, but having that tree buffer was extremely beneficial for people's cardiovascular health in particular. And so that friction is really interesting. And then this is an obvious one that people are probably well aware of, but like talk a little bit about when things are spread apart, talk a little about isolation and loneliness.
Yes,
And
and
those
we really
impacts.
felt that in COVID, right? Where you that lack of interaction was so challenging. And I remember going and meeting people at parks and standing at distances just to be around them. But yeah, if walking out of your front door and there's a map I once saw from an engineer in Florida that showed two houses that were 70 feet apart, but to get from one to the other, you had to drive several miles. There was no other way to get between the two. That sort of design means you have to be contained in a car alone or with your family to reach anybody else. And when you give away so much space to ever widening roads because we're trying to make enough space so that every single person can be in a car at any time going longer and longer distances, you're taking up space that could create the parks and the third places and the plazas and the things that bring us together. And look, I'm lucky. I live in the middle of Washington D.C. and 3 blocks from my house is a lovely little plaza that becomes a farmer's market on the weekend and go every Saturday. And I always run into my neighbors and it's not a planned meeting, but there's just people around and I meet new people and I get to hear music and that is the stuff that makes life wonderful. And in most places, the way they would have designed my community is to take the 2-lane road, main road, and turn it into a 4 or 5-lane road, and there'd be no space for that plaza. So we're creating and enforcing isolation, and if you try to do it differently, the rules say that's not allowed.
Yeah. And I know that some people listening might be saying, okay, I don't live in a city. I don't live in DC. I don't live in New York City. I live in the suburbs. I like the suburbs. And there are absolute advantages and wonderful parts about the suburbs. So talk a little bit like, are you, are you saying, okay, it's fine to be there, but it's about the design, or where are you in terms of that? Because some people do choose to live in that environment.
Absolutely, and good news for them, it's the only thing that's permitted to be built. So, that's great. Their preference is the law, and anyone that has any other preference, it's against the law to give it to them. That's not a great system. It always reminds me of the diamond industry, that what they've done is diamonds are actually not rare, but if you restrict how much can go out in the market, you can drive up their price. That's what government has done with traditional walkable communities. They've prohibited them from being built. So now they're the most expensive places in any region because we can't meet the demand for those that don't want suburban living.
Mm,
We could build both. We've just made one option illegal and artificially constrain the supply, and it's driven up the price like crazy. So now people who want that or really can't afford to own multiple cars, like me, I grew up in a family of 5. We had 4 cars to get us around. That was one of the reasons my parents couldn't help me as much in paying for college is would have been helpful because we were sustaining 4 vehicles. If others wanna live that way, God bless them. Though I think we could make suburbs better too and more walkable and less hot. But we shouldn't say that your preference should be the only thing permitted by law.
Mm,
We should have a free market for the
yeah. Well, this was something that came up. We had Ryan Johnson, who's the CEO of Cul-de-sac, a
Yes,
community
I
in
listened to it. It was a great conversation.
great. He's a car-free community in Tempe, Arizona, and it's been very successful. And his whole point was people want walkable communities. They truly do. And you and I spoke about this as well. And when we were talking about there's some HUD data on walkability and affordability. You also mentioned a bit about hotel design and how they actually create these walkable communities. So share a little bit about the idea to go deeper on the people really many people do want walkable communities.
Yeah, it's if you look at the National Association of Realtors survey on the types of homes people want, it's a little more than 50% that want to live in communities where there are restaurants and retail and groceries and things like that, a walking distance from their homes and easily walkable. The actual supply of communities like that's below 5%. So you can see why you'd get a price spike around something like that. And if you wanted to build that, we actually have a coalition of developers called Locus, and these are people that specialize in building these kinds of traditional communities. But they tell you horror stories about all the variances you have to get from the local standards to be able to build that and provide it. And because you have to get so many deviations, you have to have more patient money to be able to get through that process. The same is true on the roadways. I have met with so many engineers that want to design more walkable, safer, slower roads, but they have to go through these 18 to 24-month exceptions processes to get exceptions from the standard to be able to do that design, which means their projects come in over budget and over time, and they get punished for that. So there's just a lot that gets in the way of meeting that demand. And we know the demand is overwhelming because in every walkable community, and anytime you come into a community and add a sidewalk, all the property values go up. Every last one of them. That doesn't happen if there isn't demand for it. If there wasn't demand for it, property values would go down.
Yeah.
And we see it with transit too. Even when transit is just in the planning phase or just looking at it, we'll watch the property values around that lot, that planned line go up before it's even built because people want it so badly, but we build so little of it.
Yeah. It's so eye-opening, and it's fascinating to hear about this. And one of the things I always like to emphasize on this podcast is, positive progress and positive stories, because it's so easy to, fixate on, the problems and the challenges that we have, which we certainly have a lot of. But I'd love to hear a little bit about success stories that you've seen, whether it's in the US, ideally in this context, but also elsewhere. Like, where are people bucking the trend, pushing back, changing things? Ryan is a perfect example with cul-de-sac. I think he's done a fantastic job. Tell a little bit about some success stories that maybe you've been part of.
There's incredible things going on around the country. I almost wish I could just start a project and track them all. Because if you could see them all in one place, I think it would make people feel less alone in their challenge to change things in their area. They
Well,
all feel like,
maybe this is the next mission of Places Medicine. We start tracking some of the progress. I mean, you just
oh,
gave me a great idea.
that would be so exciting to see. I was on a call a little over a year ago where there were different local leaders coming in and talking about getting rid of parking minimums and allowing ADUs, accessory dwelling units on property, allowing people to rent out their basements, and all these little changes going on all over the place. But every time someone tries it, they say, "Who else is doing it?" We have tens of thousands of local communities. It's hard to track it all. But again, I think if it's written down someplace, you'd see what an overwhelming effort there is out there to tackle these different issues. You mentioned before, and I glossed over it, about hotels in Hawaii. If
But
you
yeah,
look at these
please.
resorts, they're building these slow, narrow roads with retail in their complex, because if you walk out in Honolulu, it's highways and high speed and much less comfortable. So they just have built their own little walkable community with retail for the people who come to stay there. And so they're showing us that it can be done. We're seeing in places like Hoboken, who hasn't seen one fatal car crash in, it's at least 7 years now, because they came in and they said, we're going to design these roadways to slow down traffic. And I know it's going to annoy people, but safety is actually our highest priority. We've seen the same in Jersey City. Here in Alexandria, Virginia, they've had a couple of no fatality years. It's not hasn't been as long lasting, but we're seeing places tackle this. We're seeing localities, get rid of these artificial parking minimums that make it hard to open coffee shops and restaurants and ma and pop shop type facilities. We're seeing people allow for an in-law unit in houses so that we can have, um, you know, uh, uh, elderly parents stay on in an affordable place near their family, or kids just starting out have their own apartment, not have to go buy a super expensive house, and making it easier to build more of that kind of housing all over the place. So it's really exciting. Sometimes when you're looking forward, it feels impossible. But my old boss, Roy Keenitz, who I worked with at USDOT, said, take a minute and look backwards and see all that you've done, and you realize that the momentum is there. It's just hard to steer the ship. I think particularly on housing, there's a lot of momentum now and we have real opportunity there. Transportation's a little bit harder because we have a program where when you pay a gas tax, it goes into a trust fund, and transportation doesn't have to come and beg for funding every year. So it flies below the radar and with less accountability. And so I
Mm.
want people to know that, and maybe come in and say, maybe transportation doesn't deserve that protection and it deserves the same accountability as every other sector. And if we started to hold the agencies as accountable as we hold other sectors, I think we'd see very quick change. So we certainly see that at the local level where they don't get quite that same protection.
It's really interesting. And so I want to ask, um, it's a little bit of a two-part question. One is, how were cities like Hoboken and Jersey City able to do this? Is it just because those cities have more control over their roads? And then a follow-on would be, what can listeners do if they're in a situation where they do want a better crosswalk, they do want better sidewalks? What should they do? Where are they pounding the table? What committees do they go to, and all of that?
Yes. Smaller town, I think that helps a lot. There's a lot more trust. The bigger the community, the less people know each other, the harder it gets. So bringing those decisions local can be very, very helpful. But they also had phenomenal leadership. They had a mayor that really cared and was willing to deal with the fact that change is not always popular and push it through anyway. He also had an incredible public works director that wasn't wedded to the way things have always been done. So that pairing of elected leadership and the technical expertise to try things differently is so powerful.
And was that
And
Hoboken, or was that?
that was Hoboken, but I think
Yeah.
you could say the exact same thing in Jersey City and in other places that we're seeing success. You need the political leadership, but you also need the technical know-how. And I would encourage folks to push their elected leaders. If they have public works and transportation appointees with dusty thinking, to push those leaders to replace them with more modern thinking. To go ahead and show up at city council meetings about changes to transportation, or local neighborhood meetings about, um, you know, putting in some sort of traffic control to deal with speeding or an area where there have been a lot of crashes. The people opposed to change never don't show up. They're always there. The supporters assume too often that the calls for safety and the facts will win the day. That's not how politics work. The people who show up get more of what they're looking for. So you need to show up. And if you can't show up in person, make a phone call in support of the change that's being proposed. Send in a letter. Stay in touch. Those things are way more powerful than people realize. When I was on Capitol Hill, I had to answer all those letters. I can tell you exactly how much time goes into thinking through what people say. So know that you're speaking up and saying we're willing to try the change matters. Another thing you can call for is to do it temporarily. And we work with a bunch of states on doing safety demonstration projects with temporary materials where we'll go in and we'll say, we're just going to do this for a month or two. And if everybody hates it, it's gone. Don't worry. But now, instead of going to a public meeting where someone lectures you and shows you sketches, now you can drive through that area or walk through that area or bike through that area. Business owners can see what it means for them and not just worry about what it might mean for them. And then we find people giving really useful feedback to their engineers saying, I know you did this so that pedestrians could be more easily seen, but I don't think it's working. And then you can work through those solutions. That can be super powerful, and it can give the agency an excuse to try something different using a demonstration project approach, and then find out it's not terrible after all, and maybe they can do it more gently.
Do you see that those successes frequently where it's been the small pilot and then like in New York City, I think some of the work that Janet City Khan did, who ran the Department of Transportation here, there were a lot of street calming measures. There was a lot of temporary taking streets over and making them pedestrian plazas, and a lot of that ended up sticking. So
Yeah, I
which is
do.
great for New York.
I saw it also in Boston about 8 years ago. The Secretary of Transportation worked with the local area to create bus only lanes, and they put them in without a lot of discussion. They just put them in to test them out. And they said, if you hate them, we're going to take them out. And we're just going to do it for 2 weeks and see what happens. And by the end of 2 weeks, everyone was screaming that they had to stay forever. It doesn't always work, but nothing experimental always works. It is a demonstration project. You try things. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. You always learn. And unfortunately, I have seen still some of the status quo win over. There's a story in New York where they did a temporary improvement. The drivers flipped out. The improvements were taken out, and a woman was killed on that exact area that would have been prevented had they left it in, walking her dog. But that's not what always happens, and that's not the majority of the cases. So it's worth trying, and then it's worth having the conversation. If you lose the call for the new design and the safety problem stays, raise it, put it out in people's faces. You said you wanted this outcome because you wanted to go fast. Do you feel that way? Now that you're seeing the consequence, can we talk about something that it's just it's a battle, not the end of the war. And in most cases, it turns out quite well, including in very rural towns. It's actually probably easier in rural towns because, again, everybody knows each other. And on state roads. This year, we're going to be working with the state of Alabama on some state roads to do temporary safety improvements. Last year, it was Kentucky. And we've done them in Alaska and California and Connecticut and Tennessee and Maryland and many other places. And they're always incredibly exciting.
Yeah. Well, it is so exciting having you on to hear about this. I think like I learned so much in this conversation and talking to you over the past week or so. I think not only that, but I hope people listening and watching will know that Smart Growth America is a really good resource for them. The reports, your information, commentary, work you guys have done, and kind of a guidebook if they want to be active in their communities as well. But this relationship between the streets around our homes, how they were designed, the implications for our health and just daily life it's it's fascinating and just such an important story to tell. So I'm so happy you were able to join. And I hope we're able to continue the conversation. So thank you.
Thank you. I hope so too. If please do come to our website. Our transportation arm, Transportation for America, has a separate website, tforamerica.org, and it on transportation, you can go in and look at how your state is not only performing in things like safety and the repair of their roadways, but what goals they're setting for themselves. And you'll find in some states they're setting a goal of more fatalities on their road. So go check it out and then call up your elected representatives
Yeah.
and ask, do they agree with that? Because we can really move things if we just point out to our electeds the outcomes we're getting.
Yeah.
The materials there. So come join us in that argument and that fight. We're making progress, and the more people who join in, the more progress we're going to make.
Yeah, and maybe it is that one thing we do at Places Medicine is start to really share these positive stories, because I
That
think
would be amazing.
they're seeing the positive change happen is, I think, such a lever. So again, thank you so much. I
Thank
appreciate
you
it.
so much.